few nights ago, I was getting absolutely smoked by my raid team's other Ret Paladin. I'm going to do a little bit of reconnaissance. What is Judd's talents? Because he is yapping me. And the worst part about this, I didn't even know why. Was it my rotation, cooldown timings, talents, stat spread, trinket, uptime? There were so many potential causes, and WoW itself is pretty terrible at telling you exactly what you're doing wrong when your damage is low. This is where Warcraft Logs comes in. On the same raid night, I was able to take my performance from this first pull to this by the end. And yes, while I still lost to the other Paladin, the improvement was massive. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I use Warcraft Logs and a couple of other adjacent third-party tools to review my gameplay in both Raid and Mythic Plus. By the end, you'll be able to use these tools yourself so that you can stop guessing why your damage is low and start actually fixing it. We'll just quickly touch on what logging actually is for those that are unaware. Warcraft Logs is a third-party tool that records your combat data in WoW and then breaks it down for analysis, right down to like individual abilities, cast, timings, and overall performance. Setting this up yourself is actually really easy. I'll leave a link in the description so that you can sort it out after the video if you want to do it yourself. It only takes a few minutes to get your own personal logs going. However, if you raid, there's a pretty good chance that your raid leader is already logging for you anyway, so you might not even need to start logging yourself. Before you dive deep into Warcraft Logs, it's pretty important to make sure that you're actually using the right talents and stat spread first. Comparing yourself to high-ranked players is still useful even with different talents, but it can be a bit pointless if your build is significantly different to theirs. For Raid, Warcraft Logs actually has a talent feature built in. If we go up to the top left menu, select the fight that we want to look at, and then choose our class and spec, it'll show us the talent spread of the top 100 logs for that encounter. Generally, I would say that anything being picked by more than 80% of the players in the top 100 is probably a mandatory talent, while anything lower than that can be seen as a flex pick. For stats and gear in Raid, I like using Archon. This gives us a good snapshot of the average stat distribution from top players in the current Raid, along with things like trinkets, gear, and enchants. For Mythic Plus, the process is extremely similar, except this is where Murlok.io comes in. With this website, you pick your class and spec. It shows you the talent choices, stat breakdown, and gear setups being used by the top 50 rated players of that spec. Similar to Archon, I would suggest that if more than 40 of the top 50 players are running a particular talent, you can probably deem that mandatory, and anything lower than that you can go based off personal preference or vibes. I'd recommend checking these tools out before you deep dive into Warcraft Logs. It's important to make sure that your character is actually all set up before we start comparing performance in detail. I'll leave links in the description that you can head to after the video. Now for the nitty-gritty. From here on out, I'm going to be using my own logs from the other night as a point of comparison. The first thing I like to do is take a quick look at what the top ranked players of my spec are doing. So we'll head over to the boss that we're analyzing, select our spec, and then scroll down below roughly the top 15 passes with a similar fight length to our own. This is good for just eyeballing what the top ranked players are doing. I avoid the top, say, 10 to 15 passes mainly because it avoids people who are doing weird things like having power infusion funneled into them or cheesing the fight purely for a high pass. Sometimes the top passes aren't always the best reflection of what an actual raid fight would look like for you. So what we want to do with these logs is, looking at the damage done, we can see what proportion of damage came from what ability for this player. So in this example here, we can see that the vast majority of damage is coming from Blade of Justice, Final Verdict, and Hammer of Light. This just gives us a very, very brief overview of the abilities that are contributing the most to the damage so that we can know to prioritize them a little bit more than the others. This is a good start point, but the real power of logs comes with the compare feature. If you go to the pool that you want to break down, click the compare button, and head down to this section here, you can select yourself. These default search settings can stay as they are, and then select search. From here, we can select a pass to compare to with a few more specific features. The options provided will automatically restrict the item level to within 2 of your own. So just grab a pass that's similar in fight length to your own and then click on that. This will now give us a direct side-by-side comparison, and there is a lot that we can unpack here. When I compare logs, I'm mainly looking at 4 things: damage breakdown, cast frequency, buff uptime, and cooldown timing. Looking at this comparison here, we want to first check the rough distribution of abilities. So we can see myself here on the left. My top damaging ability was Hammer of Light. Same for this other paladin. Second was Blade of Justice. Same for this other paladin. And then now third, Crusading Strikes. On this first pull, I wasn't running this talent, so this one we can ignore at the moment. And then Final Verdict is next. So what this tells me is that the problem with the overall output being different is likely not due to the order that abilities are being used in. We can also check the number of casts that we're getting off. What we want to look for here is, are we casting at about the same frequency as the other player? The player with the higher rank has managed to cast Final Verdict many more times than myself. 16 is quite a lot across an encounter of a similar length. We can also see that Hammer of Light we've cast the same amount of times, so we've done well on that front. Wake of Ashes we actually cast more and the other paladin cast less. So what this is sort of telling me off the bat is there's probably not a whole lot that's gone wrong with my rotation, so to speak. We can see here that most of the core abilities are within a sort of decent ballpark of one another. Now, this does show the casts, but the other thing that I think is really handy is this cast tab up here. If we go across to the casts tab, what this will show us is the total number of CPM. So that's clicks per minute or actions per minute. What this can sometimes show us is that occasionally you can have a perfectly fine rotation, but your uptime might not be the best, or you're just like leaving micro gaps between your GCDs. Now, this isn't the best comparison here because it does count Crusading Strikes as an action, and we have Templar Strikes. So we can't really directly compare these numbers here, even though on the surface it looks like this other paladin is doing way, way more actions per minute. However, if we say split the difference, we can take 100 off of this because that's about the difference from Templar Strike. And the other paladin may be pressing buttons a little bit more quickly, but we're sort of within a ballpark of one another, so it doesn't appear to be the issue. Another thing that is really handy is the timeline feature. So if we click this timeline up here, we can then go down and see at what time each of us cast our major abilities. For Retribution Paladin, this is maybe a little bit less important, especially on a fight where, like this other Paladin, is running Truth's Wake, so the 30-second cooldown wings. However, it can be really, really good to check, not so much when they are using like these sort of filler abilities, because that's sort of useless, but in particular your major cooldown. So if you're looking at a log and you're noticing that they're doing like significantly more damage, even though you're doing something exactly the same, it may just be that they have sent, say, their major cooldown 15 or 20 seconds later to line up with something else in the fight. Another thing that's worth noting, just as a sort of quick thing, is the replay function. So this is a really cool feature, actually. It will show the positioning of every single person in the raid as the fight goes on. This is probably not something that you would want to look at until you've done a fight heaps of times. So the idea behind this is that you'll be able to see where you have positioned yourself or where the other player has positioned themselves, so that you can maybe get a sense of like what they're doing. This is particularly useful for things like range DPS with big cooldowns, you know, potentially finding like a spot where they can plant and then spam cast, but just a cool feature that's worth noting, I think. Now we'll have a quick look at Mythic Plus. The process for this is actually fairly similar, but there are a couple of differences. Compared to Raid, it's actually a lot harder to find one-to-one comparisons, since things like route choices pretty drastically change what the end output actually looks like. For Mythic Plus, I actually prefer doing a direct side-by-side comparison, so opening up one tab with your pass and then another tab with a comparison pass. So when it comes to choosing a log, I would ordinarily just go into the specific dungeon that you want to look at. In this case, we're going to be doing Halls of Atonement for myself, because this seems to be the easiest one to do a comparison on. We're going to select Retribution Paladin. And we want the keystone level to be a +20 in particular. So let's compare to, say, VC3. So now that we've got these both side by side, what we want to do is select ourselves and then select who we're comparing to. Again, we just want to sort of eyeball the breakdown of damage. So in both cases, we can see that Empyrean Hammer is the highest, so that is generally a good sign. We can see that Hammer of Light comes in at number 2. Divine Storm and Wake of Ashes, now they are flipped around, but they're sort of both pretty close to one another, so that I would say is generally a positive as well. Looking at it on the surface, it's not abundantly clear as to why there's much of a damage difference. Now, in saying that, we are looking at a fairly sort of narrow margin, but still. What I think is much more important for Mythic Plus comparison is the Casts tab. So if we go to Casts, assuming that we're running the same talents, this is the thing where I think most Mythic Plus passes fall apart. Now, with myself on the left, we've already looked and saw the damage breakdown is, you know, it's roughly similar, and a lot of the like cast amounts here are very, very close together. But the one really big thing to notice is that my casts per minute is 82.8, making it 2,460 total, whereas VC3 had 90 at 2,650 total. What this is telling me is that the thing that has probably lost me the most damage is downtime. That has either been not pressing my buttons fast enough to keep up with the global cooldown, or just straight up getting corralled away from mobs. So if you're finding that the abilities that you're casting is, you know, actually quite similar to the comparison log, it's worth checking to see your casts per minute, because if it is significantly lower, it generally means that you're not actually squeezing out as many button presses as you possibly could. So in this case, I'm basically pressing buttons 10% slower than this other log here. In this case, I would say that the improvement that was required back now during this key would have been to basically just press my buttons faster. So work more on my positioning and being able to keep on top of the global cooldown even when things started to get hectic. Hopefully that gives you a much better idea of how to actually use Warcraft Logs without getting overwhelmed by all the information. There are likely a lot of other features in there that you could also use, but I find this to be the best way to just sort of diagnose problems with damage output without really having to go right into the weeds. You don't need to understand every single tab. Most of the time, if you just compare yourself directly to a player that's performed better, look at the casts, look at the buff up times, and look at your cooldown timings, you'll be able to get a pretty solid idea of what you need to change in order to improve your gameplay. I want to say once again a massive shout out to my channel supporters and Buy Me a Coffee supporters. Ghost Splinter, The Joy of Checks, Tobias, and Yulem at the Keystone Legend tier. Thank you very much, all of you. It is very much appreciated. That's all from me. Hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, gamers. Take care.